The last section on the handout in full. Just in case we don't have time to go over it, you can read some of that at your leisure. But this is a part of a chapter from my dissertation that I just defended in November. And the project of that dissertation is to give an account of human nature, human virtue, and human reason that they all work together, and that is naturalistic in a sense that I define. So I'm explicitly bracketing theism in my dissertation and not arguing for a Christian philosopher. So I was telling, what's your name? Scott. I was telling Scott that I'm an Eastern Orthodox philosopher, and so I'm also one of nature's strangest beasts, like an evangelical philosopher.
So you
but they let me in. They said ETS doesn't mean Eastern Orthodox. You know that, right? I grew up evangelical, so I still feel like I fit in. So this is part of the project, is to say that being human and being rational and being good are of a piece. That you don't have to say, well, being human is value neutral, but being rational, that's something additional. That's something like supernatural. And so I'm trying to give an account. And I think Aristotle gives this kind of account. The question is, can we really still be Aristotelians in the era of modern science? Sort of the question. So it's very, I just put the argument in there without much context, but hopefully you'll enjoy it and have some questions. And I am going to be presenting this to my secular colleagues at University of Kentucky next month. So any objections you have will help me anticipate those. So, everyone must live according to both instinct and choice. Instinct is automatic and unreflective, but once choice is introduced, one must reflect, or else live irrationally. Call practical reasoning the process of reflecting on how to live. We answer all practical questions by practical reasoning, from the most specific to the most general. What should I wear today? What career should I pursue? And most basically, how should I live? By practical reasoning, we reflect on our actions and those of others, evaluate them, and justify or blame them with reference to normative principles. Given that everyone must engage in practical reasoning, how are we to understand this process? Philosophers dispute over two major rival views. The first view is that practical reasoning is intrinsically valuable and value-laden. Everyone tries to do reasoning well, and the people who succeed are wise. The traditional view is associated with Aristotle, but extends far beyond him into the Aristotelian tradition. The second view is that practical reasoning is a more mechanical and value-neutral procedure. There's handouts here if you'd like to grab them. Everyone strategizes means to their chosen ends, but those ends are chosen by preference, passion, authority, whim, or aspiration. Those ends are some good and some bad. The second view defines things such that one can fall into the grip of many vices and still be practically rational, even cunning and wise, despite one's inhuman ends. A scientist, philosopher, theologian, or public servant who is wicked could still be perfectly rational in cleverly adjudicating means to their ends. But is it true that one can be both vice-ridden and practically rational? In this paper, I offer a contemporary defense of the traditional view that practical reason is intrinsically aimed at the good, and that therefore immoral decisions and habits are rational mistakes. Not just moral mistakes, rational mistakes. I first explain the default Aristotelian view of realism about goodness and practical reason, and briefly summarize the rival contemporary Humean view, and then I critique the Humean view and mount a defense of a neo-Aristotelian account of practical reason. To speak with a broad historical horizon, the default view of practical reasoning in Western philosophy was realism. On this view, as it was expressed by Aristotle, human beings are rational animals. That is, we both respond to the world by instinct and evaluate the world by reason. Reason or rationality has a double nature, both theoretical and practical. For we are able to think theoretically about mathematics, astronomy, theology, history, and so on. We're also able to think practically about technical, ethical, and political pursuits. On this view, practical reason is, quote, a capacity for reflection about an objective body of normative truths regarding action, unquote. That's J. Wallace. In other words, realism says that good or bad are objectively real features of the world, or perhaps their objective relations between ourselves and the world. For example, some foods are actually good for me to eat and others bad, given the kind of thing that I am and the kind of things they are. Puffball mushrooms are good for humans, while death cap mushrooms are bad, simply because they're deadly. The objective features of such mushrooms in conjunction with the features of human physiology make it such that some actions are categorically for us and others not for us. There's a handout there if you'd like one, Danny. To take a more ethically significant example, each human being is confronted with sexual desires. How should I dispose myself as a sexual creature is therefore a practical question of some urgency that most people cannot avoid, excluding the asexual for the moment. And some sexual behaviors are good, monogamy, because they are for humans, arguably, while others are bad, incest, because they are categorically not for human beings. Practical reasoning, then, on this view, is a process of evaluating the world and ourselves to discover what is worth pursuing and what merits avoiding. For this reason, recent Neo-Aristotelians are insistent there can be no adequate theory of ethics without a theory of practical rationality. So the trend is to divide ethics from these other kind of like purely descriptive or theoretical disciplines. And the Neo-Aristotelians say, no, you have to describe the world accurately to live well. And they're connected. Practical reasoning begins with broad questions such as, why should I act at all? Given that some things are obviously worth pursuing, practical reason attempts to determine the major decisions of life, career, relationships, hobbies, and so on. Answering these general questions with specific principles and even more specific actions is the business of being human. In sum, the default view is that practical reasoning is a distinctively human process of reflecting on objectively true practical reasons by which one lives a good and human life. This view may be wrong, but it is what Thomas Nagel calls a defeasible presumption. It's disprovable, but it's fair to assume that it's true. Burden of proof is on the opponent. Even anti-realism's most sophisticated advocates, such as J.L. Mackie, admit that objective value is, quote, the main tradition of European moral philosophy, unquote, and, not just the philosophers, that it has, quote, a firm basis in ordinary thought and even in the meaning of moral terms, unquote. So yeah, when we talk, we assume moral realism, and common sense accepts moral realism, and most philosophers accept moral realism, but it's still wrong, says Mackie. Of course, the term objective value is sort of like legal crime. It's sort of a contradiction in terms. So I don't know why anybody would try to defend objective value with C.S. Lewis. You have to change the terms to make the case. Pet peeve. So Alan Gibbard goes so far as to suggest that realist Platonism about normative truths is common sense. This simple and powerful conception of human nature and practical reasoning held sway for many centuries and still holds sway in some circles. Nevertheless, realism is no longer the default view among philosophers, especially those who lean analytic. Section 2, the rival view. The main objection against realism comes from a commitment to naturalism and a corresponding threat of supernaturalism. It's a quote from John McDowell. Or rampant Platonism from Alan Gibbard. Philosophers such as Gibbard protest, quote, nothing in a plausible naturalistic picture of our place in the universe requires non-natural facts, such as moral values, and these powers of non-sensory apprehension, such as the ability to intuit that something is just wrong. Say. There are no non-natural norms, and there is no corresponding non-naturalistic human capacity to intuit them. Hence, the anti-realist alternative either aims to debunk the objective purport of practical reasoning, or to reclaim it within the confines of a respectable naturalism. The rival view, forcefully presented by David Hume, pictures practical reasoning as a procedure for adjudicating one's own ends. The Humean model of practical reasoning asserts that, quote, cognition and volition are distinct, unquote. Practical reasons cannot motivate, at at least not by themselves. So death cap mushrooms are deadly is not by itself a reason not to eat them. You have to say, and I don't prefer to die. Right? So just the fact that they're deadly isn't motivating and doesn't feature in your actions necessarily unless you have this additional desire component. He says reason is the discovery of truth and falsehood, but passions, preferences, and so on are what move us to act. So Hume's answer to the question, why does one act at all, is that one finds oneself with certain passions or motives already in place. Right? I like my own pleasure, or I like being with people. And then practical reasoning comes in to try to figure out how to achieve those things that I find myself wanting. But you can't really rationally critique your passions. In fact, he says you shouldn't try to rationally critique your passions, because your passions are their own master, reasons to serve them. In other words, to figure out how to achieve your passions. So we're going to call this view proceduralism, because I'm using Hume as slightly as a caricature there. So I don't want to say this is the Humean view, but proceduralism is the view that human beings are mere animals whose characteristic form of life involves highly rarefied neurological and cognitive processes we do not observe in other animals. Right? So whereas I say, I wonder why I exist and why there is something rather than nothing, the mockingbird goes, wah. That's just philosophical questions are just a sound that I emit because of the kind of animal that I am. You know, is there a God? Woof. They're just two different, two different animal expressions. So on this view, practical reasoning is something that I do. It's not something by which I access the world, because nature is a closed physical system of cause and effect with no normative or evaluative properties, no objective values in it. Practical reason, therefore, cannot be the identification of ethical facts out there, but must be something we do to express and achieve our goals. Section 3, the chief difficulty of proceduralism. So can contemporary scientifically minded philosophers reclaim what is satisfying about the traditional realist view? I think so. The first point to be made is that even instrumental reason involves a minimal commitment to substantive realism about practical reasoning. So my first objection to the Humean sort of procedural view is you're not actually disagreeing with me. You're not rejecting the basic premise that practical reason involves commitment to some fundamental good. Suppose for a moment you could engage in practical reasoning without a commitment to some general good. So for reductio absurdum. J. Wallace points out that instrumental rationality in its most basic form instructs agents to take those means that are necessary in relation to their given ends. But on the anti-realist assumption, why should I care to take the means necessary to my ends? Why should I not aim to fly by jumping in the ocean, or aim to swim by getting on a plane? The only reply from the proceduralist would be that, well, it is just rational to adjudicate the proper means to your ends. But then the proceduralist is assuming the objective goodness of that kind of rationality, that if you have an end and if you know the means to that end, it's substantively rational to use those means to that end. And I can say, well, by substantively rational, that's what I mean. That's the Aristotelian is pushing to. So you're agreeing with me. The first question practical reason asks is why act at all? The proceduralist, no less than the realist, must provide an account of this question in its first answer. For without an answer, one would not act. Without a rational answer, not just a passion or a motive or an instinct. The person who does not pursue anything would waste away, like Bartleby the Scrivener. If you guys didn't know that Melville story, Bartleby just answers, I prefer not to every question. So if you don't do your work, you're going to get fired. I prefer not to. So they fire him and they leave him out on the street. You need to go home. You don't have a job anymore. I prefer not to. So he sits on the street. If you don't leave, we're going to have to take you to jail. You have to go home. I prefer not to. They take him to jail, and he eventually won't even eat. Right? They put food before him, and he says, I prefer not to. And he just sort of dies in the prison just from starvation. So there was someone with no practical motives. Yeah. The last line from Melville is, "Ah, Bartleby, ah, humanity." That's us. The idea there is that to be a practical reasoner at all is to act, by definition, in pursuit of a particular object that you judge to be good. Warren Quinn convinced Philippa Foot of this thesis with this argument. Quote, "Practical thought, like any other thought, requires a subject matter. And for human beings, the subject matter that distinguishes thought as practical, in the first instance, is human ends in action, insofar as they are good or bad in themselves. Practical thought deploys a master set of non-instrumental evaluative notions, that of a good or bad human act, a good or bad human life, a good or bad human agent, and a good or bad human action. Without that fundamental vocabulary, you cannot act at all, quite human. Practical reason is, on this view, the faculty that applies these fundamental evaluative concepts and gives them more determination." End quote. Philippa Foot found Quinn's point compelling and began to see, quote, "goodness as setting a necessary condition of practical rationality, and therefore as at least a part determinant of the thing itself. Goodness is a determinant of practical rationality itself." Unquote. So the proceduralist about practical reasoning, no less than the realist, needs a sufficiently general starting point for procedural reasoning to even get off the ground. Call these first principles. It has a nice medieval flair to it. The alternative to aiming at the good is not aiming at some value-neutral end or goal. The alternative to aiming at the good is ceasing to act at all. It turns out that the proceduralist is not rejecting first principles, but replacing them. Where an Aristotelian enjoins everyone to, quote, "be human," right, as a fundamental sort of, if you will, a categorical imperative. Be human. Or be rational. The proceduralist replaces that with the pseudo-technical injunction to achieve your goals, whatever they may be, or configure the appropriate means to your chosen ends. But if you ask for a justification for that, then they can't give you one. That's a first principle. So if we accept this point, and I do not see how to avoid it, then we are already committed to a minimally substantive view of practical reason rather than a merely procedural one. So any rival to the Aristotelian account of practical reason cannot dispense with an answer to this question, why act at all? They must defend their own rival answer. Okay, so section 4. Now I shall try to sketch the Neo-Aristotelian account more fully, building on the work of Philippa Foot and on Jennifer Frey's recent discussions of Anscombe and Aquinas. I shall argue, and again, I'm trying not to invoke any sort of religious doctrine here, even though Aquinas, I'm building on Aquinas. So tell me if you see me sneaking in any sort of Christian theology, but I think you can do this from sort of observation and reflection. I shall argue that practical reasoning is not merely a procedure or instrument, but necessarily an activity aimed at the good human life. Let's unpack this thought. The first point in this case is to notice that goodness, desire, motivation, and end-directed activity are not just features of human beings, but features of all organic life. As Thomas Nagel argues, the existence of value seems to be coextensive with the existence of living things. He says as soon as you have bacteria, you have an entity for which things can go well or badly. All organisms exhibit teleological movement. That is, they grow into maturity and exemplify their life form. Things are specified by their activity. Plants exemplify their life form by simply growing. Trees extend roots into the ground by nature. Apple trees deposit apple seeds in the ground by nature, and so on. Animals incline toward their own good by instinct, pursuing life and reproduction while avoiding injury, death, and extinction. A form of life is what Aristotle and Aquinas call a nature. Wolves hunt in packs by nature. If a wolf is hunting alone, he's either in between packs or rabid and has been abandoned by his pack. So if you see a wolf hunting alone, that's unnatural. It's not according to its life form. Reptiles warm themselves in the sun by nature, and so on. Animals use sensory perception and even social cooperation to pursue their good and avoid their bad. But they cannot use complex recursive language or rational reflection. Animals, lower animals that is, do not perceive as. They do not perceive things as falling under universal categories. Human beings engage in cognitive and deliberative activities that require the ability to recognize universals, or at least universal concepts. While other animals have sensation and perception, and humans have sensation, perception, and intellection, the power of abstracting formal properties from what is perceived. Other animals can respond to an informed, organized object, but humans can acquire information from such objects. This extra ability creates the possibility of practical reasoning. For even my instincts, sensations, and natural desires can be taken up in a deliberative act. Confronted with some desire to, say, eat food, let's say that I'm hungry and there's some food right there, but I don't eat it. How can I overcome my own sort of instinctual desires? Well, maybe because I have a practical reason that says that's your food, and I shouldn't eat your food, right? Or that's poisonous, and so even though it looks nice, I know it's poisonous. I know I shouldn't eat it. I shouldn't just give in to whatever passions I find myself with. Similarly, confronted with the fear of, say, a spider, I can flee, which would be my animal instinct, or I can overcome the fear for good reason. I know that spider is not poisonous and therefore not dangerous, right? One of my sister's friends was so scared of the spider in the closet, she called my sister and said, the spider's in the closet, you gotta come home and help me. Well, did you hairspray it? Yeah, it's still moving. Did you throw a shoe at it? No, I was afraid it would throw it back. The fear is overwhelming reason at that point, right? So the point is, animals and even plants act, and they pursue their sort of good unreflectively. But humans act for reasons and pursue our good reflectively. And Jennifer Frey summarizes, quote, rational animals, like any animal, have a natural inclination toward their good as a whole, and like lower animals, this power is actualized through their apprehension of things in the world. But Aquinas argues that a rational animal relates to the world through the application of universal concepts, dangerous, or delicious, or healthy. Thus, it is inclined to pursue or avoid things under an intellectual, universal apprehension of them. Thus, Aquinas says that the will is inclined towards its object under the formality of the universal good, rather than the particular good. So you can't say, I start out just desiring certain goods, milk and warmth and comfort. The universal good has to come before the particular goods. And that's the first principle, if you will. So Aquinas' answer to the question, why do we act at all, is sort of like, why do we think at all? Well, we first notice that things exist. It's sort of like a cognitive prior kind of like moment before you start to think about particular things. Similarly, good is the first sort of thing that your will apprehends or practical reason apprehends. So he gives you the first precept of practical reason, the first principle of all action, rational action. That is, the good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. To put the point differently, Jennifer Frey's recent work argues, there could be no reasons at all unless a rational animal has a general conception of its own good, and thus a general sense of how to live. The idea here is that practical reasoning is constituted by a few, or maybe one, very general rational motives. Practical reason cannot address questions such as what should I eat or what should I do for a career without presuming upon a pre-existing commitment to some general ends, such as survival or a satisfying life that makes a positive